Hey, my name is Achim Kopp, and I'm the director of the Great Books program here at Mercer. And tonight I want to welcome you for our first annual Great Books 101 lecture. And I would also like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Charlie Thomas, who is an instructor in the Great Books program and a professor of philosophy. And she is probably actually one of those who have been with the Great Books program the longest. You may not know this, but Dr. Thomas not only is teaching these courses, she also went through the courses as a student, as an undergraduate. And so she actually was one of the first winners of the Great Book, Outstanding Great Book Senior Awards. So. We have both traveled recently to Troy, and so tonight we want to bring you some of our impressions from this site, and we hope that we will be able to make some connections to the text that you're reading, the Iliad. Our talk consists, I think, of three major parts. We'll take turns, but there are three distinct parts. And the first one is the archaeology of Troy. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of the archaeology and who excavated the site and what was found during those excavations. Then Dr. Thomas will make the connection between the site and the text and go deeper into some of the passages of the text. And then I will come back, since I'm a Latinist, the Romans are dear to my heart, and so I want to make a connection at the end and talk a little bit about the Roman presence at the site of Troy. For the Romans, this was a very important place, and I will tell you later why that was. So let's talk about the archaeological activity at the site of Troy. First of all, here's a map of Turkey. Troy, of course, is in Turkey. You see the Mediterranean Sea, you see Italy and Greece, and you see the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. Here's a larger map of the country of Turkey. In the left-hand top corner, you can see the capital of Istanbul, and Troy is actually not very far from there. You can also see here the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. So you can imagine this strait of water was a very important throughway for trade and for any kind of traffic. Here you have the Troas, the area where Troy is located. Again, this is the entryway of the Dardanelles. The island of Tenedos, right there, plays a big role in the Iliad. This is the peninsula of Gallipoli. Some of you may have heard of the events that happened there in World War I, when the British and Australian and New Zealandish forces tried to invade this part of Turkey and failed. So this shows you that this was strategically a very important part of the world. When Homer came there, probably in the early 8th century, around 725 or so, most scholars today assume he probably saw some ruins. He saw some of the ruins of the Troy of the Mycenaean era, but he probably didn't see much of where the ships had been beached, because at that time the harbor area had already been silted in, and so he probably saw some ruins, but could most likely not really locate any of this place. On this slide, I'm showing you some of the names that have been used for the site. The mound today, the tell, the mound of rubble, is called Hisarlik. But the site itself was always known as Troy, or Troja rather, and that goes back to the king Tros, the mythological king of Troy, and from that name we then derive the English word Troy and also the Turkish word Truva, for example. The Greeks knew the site as Ilion, or Ilium, as the Romans then later Latinized it. And that goes back to the son of Tros, that king. He had a son named Ilos, and so that's where the name Ilion probably comes from. Now there is some metrical evidence in the Iliad which shows that the word Ilion probably had what we call a digamma letter in front of it, which is like kind of like a w sound. So it was probably not Ilion, but Wilion. We can tell that from the metrical evidence in the text. Now, that would then make one theory very plausible, because there is a place, a Hittite name for a place in this area, which is called Wilusa. And so Wilion comes very close to that word Wilusa. And there's also a Hittite name that resembles the name of Troy, which is Truwisa. So there are some interesting connections there. This Hittite background is always there. Just recently, a seal was found in one of the layers of Troy, which had a Hittite name on it, a Hittite word, a Luwian word. And so that's another piece of evidence that there were connections. But we really don't know how strong these connections were. We cannot really tell from this what language the inhabitants of Troy spoke. All this there's a lot of speculation about this. Here's a picture of the mound. You can sort of see how it tops the middle. The structure in the background is a modern roof that the excavators built to protect some of the structures. Now, the first people to assume that this place was the ancient Troy were actually the Romans. And I will tell you later why that is and why that was so important for them. There were also some romantic European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries who went to the place and tried to look for evidence from the Iliad and tried to compare the descriptions in the text with the site. But the more serious philologists of the 19th and 20th centuries didn't really buy it. They more or less denied this connection, and as you know, probably know, there were actually philologists who claimed that Homer didn't exist and that there was no real connection to any kind of reality. So that the Iliad was really strictly fictitious. Dr. Thomas will talk about this more later, but I'm showing you here a sketch of some of the different layers that were found. We call these layers strata, and the place was actually most likely inhabited all the way through from 3000 BC to about 500 AD. There was a little bit of a hiatus between, I think, 950 and 700 BC, but that's a really short little time. So, and these are the different layers of the cities that existed on this mound. The American archaeologists, of whom I will tell you in a minute, actually differentiate 46 different strata, substrata. So 9 main strata and 46 substrata can be distinguished. Today, nobody actually lives on this mound, which is kind of interesting, because if you think about it, there are other ancient places where people actually live today. Take Rome or Athens or even Corinth. But in Troy, nobody lives at the site. Instead, the site has become a National Historical Park since 1996. And when you drive into the site, oh, here, actually, this, I forgot to mention this. these are the different layers in reality. You see the little plaques on the wall, which give you an idea from which stratum these pieces of wall are. Now, if you drive into the site, you see this sign, and that tells you that the site has recently become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that was in 1998. So let me now talk a little bit about the different people who excavated on that mound. The first one was a guy called Frank Calvert. He was a British expatriate whose brothers worked in the consular service for the British, and who himself actually sometimes stood in for his brothers as a consul in Turkey. And also, as far as I found out, in 1974, he was actually also a United States consular. Now, this man had heard from another scholar, from a scholar, Charles McLaren, who in 1822 claimed that Hisarlik, the mound of Hisarlik, was the actual site of Troy. And so his family, he was fascinated with this, and so his family actually bought part of the mound. They owned the eastern part of the mound. And he started digging there, but he didn't get very deep. So he never really reached any of the significant layers or strata. And in the 1860s, he came into touch with Heinrich Schliemann, and I'm sure you've heard that name before. Heinrich Schliemann, who later became one of the foremost excavators of Troy, and he convinced Schliemann that it was worthwhile digging at this site and looking for the ancient Troy. Calvert has been forgotten until recently. There is a book that just recently came out. It's a book by Susan Hugh Allen, and she gives all credit to Calvert and takes the credit away from Schliemann, who's had it for centuries, and actually gives it to Calvert and says that without Calvert there would actually have been no Schliemann and probably no discovery of the site. It's also quite interesting, the families of Calvert. There must be, as far as I found out, there is one part of the family that lives in Britain and another part that lives in the United States. Both these strands are now trying in litigation to get some of the treasure back that Schliemann found, because they claim they found it on Frank Calvert's, or he found it on Frank Calvert's land, and therefore the treasure should really belong to the Calvert family. Okay, here he is, Heinrich Schliemann. You've heard a lot about him, I'm sure. He was a German. He was really a businessman who had a strong interest in archaeology, but he was really an amateur archaeologist. He made his fortune in import-export business. He was a nut for languages. I think he knew like 10 or 12 different languages and studied these languages by himself. He was also in this country for a while during the California gold rush. He came to the United States and actually set up a bank and made more money by doing so. Then went back to Russia, did some more import-export, met his wife in Russia, his first wife, Ekaterina, and married her, and then through the Crimean War, he again, as a military contractor, made a fortune. So at a certain point, he was able to retire from his business undertakings and devote himself completely to his interest, to classical archaeology. He was digging not only in Troy, he also was in Mycenae, for example, or in Tiryns, on the Peloponnese in Greece, and in Ithaca. So Troy was only one of his interests. And he, in 1871, then took over the excavations from Frank Calvert. In 1872, the two had a falling out, and 1 year later, Schliemann stayed with it, and 1 year later, he actually found what is now called Priam's treasure, or the treasure of Priam. So he assumed, when he found that gold, that he had found Homer's Troy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that claim later. He was a shrewd person. I think there are reports how when he found the gold, he dismissed his workers, so he was able to take the gold out without anybody seeing it. Here you have a picture of his second wife, Sophia, who was a young Greek woman, and he actually put the gold and the jewelry that he found in Troy on her, and this became a very famous photograph in Europe and the world at the time. Now, in 1874, he actually described his findings, and in the meantime, he had smuggled the treasure out of Turkey. And so the reaction of the Turkish authorities was, as you can imagine, they withdrew the permit for him. So he was no longer able to dig. Only very little of this jewelry and these items remain in Turkey today. Schliemann took most of it to Germany, and the bigger part of the treasure was exhibited in Berlin and in other German museums. This is what's left in Istanbul, in the Archaeological Museum. So you get an idea, there's not very much. The gold and the jewelry that was in Berlin met a very ugly fate, because during World War II, much of this was actually lost and destroyed, and some of it was also allegedly taken by Russian soldiers. So a lot of people today assume that large parts of this treasure from Troy is actually in Russia today, but nobody seems to know for sure. Schliemann then also went on to dig in Mycenae. You've probably heard about the mask of Agamemnon, which he found there, and today you can see that in the Archaeological Museum in Athens. He got a new permit for Troy in 1878, and so he returned to Troy for 3 further campaigns. I was fascinated to see that one of his fellow diggers, fellow excavators, was actually a physician from the University of Heidelberg, Rudolf Virchow. When I studied in Heidelberg in the 80s, there was a Virchow clinic in Heidelberg. So this is very interesting how these scholars, who were really, in this case, medical doctors and medical scholars, on the side had this interest in digging and helped Schliemann with his work in Troy. At that time also there comes another person into view, and that is Wilhelm Dörpfeld, and I'm going to talk about him in a little while. But he started at that time as Schliemann's helper. Schliemann is being criticized today, as you know, for this. This is what we call Schliemann's trench. So this trench was actually dug by Schliemann's workers, and you can see that this quite violently digs into the different strata of the mound and destroyed a lot. So one of the criticisms is that he did a lot of bad things to the mound and destroyed a lot of the evidence. And the other criticism is, of course, that he took a lot of things that he found out of the country and didn't really leave them at the site. What he thought was Homer's Troy has, I think, today been shown to be really a much older layer. What he thought was Homer's Troy is probably Troy II, which is about 1,000 years older than the Homeric Troy. So he's been proven quite wrong in his assumptions. And I think Dr. Thomas wanted to say a few words about Schliemann.
Yeah, very quickly. Thanks. So Dr. Kopp's part of this talk is going to continue for a minute talking some more about the archaeologists. But Schliemann is such a mythical character in himself that we thought we'd double up a little bit and I'd throw a couple of anecdotes at you. A lot of this stuff Dr. Kopp's already mentioned, but and this will come out when I start showing you some more images of the site. But one of the things I think the takeaways of all of this is, even though Troy is very old, very, 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 very old. I'm not sure that was enough varies, but it's very old. Archaeology is very young. And so all of these archaeologists in the 19th century were amateurs. I was in Delphi this summer, and someone asked, and Delphi is all about Apollo and Dionysus, and Nietzsche, the German philosopher Nietzsche, wrote about Apollo and Dionysus, and somebody said, did Nietzsche ever come and visit Delphi? It seems like he should have come and visit Delphi. And it took me a minute, and I realized that Delphi just wasn't excavated when Nietzsche was doing his thing in the 19th century. These ideas, these places that are so important in ancient literature simply were buried. And the people that uncovered them were amateurs who were really pushing against the grain of the scholarship of the day. As Dr. Kopp said, the consensus of the day, the scholarly consensus was that Troy was a mythological place. And nobody with any self-respect was going to go look for it. So you needed somebody like Schliemann who was willing to wear this hat and dig in Turkey. He apparently declared when he was 8 years old that he would discover Troy. Did that actually happen? Who knows? There's all this mythology around the guy. The story is that somebody walked into a bar and started reciting the Iliad in archaic Greek, and he was mesmerized by it and was inspired for the rest of his life to do that. But he started getting good schooling, so he had a foundation of learning languages, but his father apparently was as speculative as he was, or maybe not quite so much. And they've lost the family fortune, and he had to quit school. And so he didn't get to finish any kind of formal education in the classics. He had to do it himself. But he as he said, became a businessman, made a fortune in the California gold rush, but he kept his love of Homer the whole time. He was 46 years old, he had more money than he knew what to do with, so he decided he was going to go find Troy. Just a couple of things about this. I won't go through these dates again, but I do think they're interesting to sort of think about this. Schliemann, of course, there weren't the same kind of rules about archaeology that there are now, the permit system and having handlers from the host country watch you. There were people watching him in Mycenae because they knew what had happened in Turkey. But Schliemann just figured that Hisarlik, and Hisarlik means castle hill. Right? Everybody kind of knew there was something on Hisarlik. What they didn't know was that it was Troy. And they weren't even looking for it exactly because, again, no self-respecting person would go look for Troy. Troy was a mythological place. It's like looking for King Arthur's court or something. People do it, but not really, not serious people. So he went and did it. He figured that it must be if you find this hill and Troy is going to be there, it's going to be at the bottom, right? Because there couldn't be anything older than Homer's Troy, right? Nothing possible. So he takes a bulldozer in, really does, and cuts into the hill. We'll see that cut again in a minute. And he gets to the bottom, he sees something shiny, he sends everybody away to lunch, and he digs it out. Next thing you know, he's at a cocktail party, and he takes his wife dressed in what he's calling the jewels of Helen. The Turkish government sees the pictures in the newspaper of the gold from Troy, and they revoke his permit to dig. The stuff that the treasures, the little bit of a treasure from Troy that Istanbul, that Turkey has now, Schliemann actually gave to Turkey in order to get permission to come back and dig Troy. If if Schliemann had hadn't given some of this back in order to come back to the dig, he would, Istanbul, Turkey would not have any of the treasure at all. So let's look at the cut one more time. Schliemann's trench, Schliemann's cut, because I really do think it's emblematic of the whole thing. Schliemann is like a bull in a china shop. He sees a hill, there's the sort of top of the hill, and he just drives into it until he sees something shiny. So it's pretty awful in terms of archaeological process. Calvert, you can imagine on his own land, trying to do something a little more subtle, more contemporary archaeologists trying to do something that shows a little bit more respect for the site. On the other hand, Schliemann actually found Troy. And I think it's one of these really interesting, if we have time to talk about this or any of you are interested, one of these really interesting questions about Schliemann. On the one hand, his brashness and his sort of amateurishness causes you pain when you see the site, because you wonder how many things were lost because of his ham-handed approach. On the other hand, that mound was sitting there for millennia, and nobody found Troy, and very few people, even no serious people, really thought it was worth looking for, and he found it. So Schliemann is himself a kind of a myth worth engaging, I think.
Okay, we continue in the story of the excavation. I already mentioned Wilhelm Dörpfeld, a fellow German of Schliemann's, who took over the excavations after Schliemann's death. Schliemann died in 1890 in Naples, actually. His grave today is in Athens, and I understand that his house that he had in Athens is today a numismatic museum. But Dörpfeld took over after Schliemann, so his excavations lasted from 1893 to 1894. He had started out as an excavator in Olympia, in Greece, and joined Schliemann in 1882. Other places he had excavated were Tiryns, Pergamon in Turkey, and also the Acropolis and the Agora in Athens. He's important in that he is really the one who first refined or actually invented this stratigraphic method of distinguishing different strata, different layers of archaeological remains. So he's the one who came up with the 9 different layers in Troy. And he corrected a lot of Schliemann's assumptions, for example, the one that Schliemann had actually found the Homeric Troy. Dörpfeld established the contemporaneity of Troy 6 and Troy 7a with Mycenae and Tiryns. In Mycenae, he also corrected Schliemann. Schliemann had found what he named the Treasury of Atreus, which was a building with a big dome. You can still see it today. And Dörpfeld is actually the one who said, this is not a treasury, this is simply a thallus grave, and so a thallus tomb. And so he corrected one of Schliemann's assumptions in Mycenae as well. After Dörpfeld, the excavations were quiet for a while, until the Americans came in. And here you see Carl Blagan, who was an American born in Minneapolis from Norwegian immigrant parents. And he had, early in his career, helped with the excavations in Corinth, and then became a professor at the University of Cincinnati, became a professor for classical archaeology. And from 1932 to 1938, he was the director of the excavations in Troy. He provided further evidence about Troy 7a being the Homeric Troy, and he's also the one who refined Dörpfeld's 9-layer theory into no fewer than 46 different substrata. So his team of excavators claimed that they were able to distinguish 46 different strata. At the end of his career, he excavated Nestor's palace, and those of you who have read the Odyssey know that that, of course, is at Pylos on the Peloponnese. Here's one of the latest excavators. We're back with the Germans, Manfred Kaufmann. He was a professor from the University of Tübingen, started as an assistant and a worker or a helper at the German Archaeological Institute in Istanbul in the 1970s, then became a professor in Tübingen in 1982, and in 1988, he obtained a permit from the Turkish authorities to dig in Troy. The biggest difference, I think, between him and his predecessors is that his predecessors all seemed to concentrate and focus on the citadel, on the mound itself, whereas Kaufmann's interest was much more at the foot of the mound. So the sub-city, the city that was outside these ancient walls, and so he excavated quite a bit there. And I think was able to show that Troy was actually much bigger than had been assumed earlier. In 2001, there was an exhibit in Stuttgart, maybe some of you may remember that, which was quite controversial. There was a lot of back and forth between the experts, but I think Kaufmann in the end was able to show that he had found a substantial city outside the walls. Unfortunately, Kaufmann died quite early. He died of lung cancer in 2005, and there's quite an interesting story about him. He just before his death, he assumed the middle name Osman, which is of course a Turkish name, and apparently that was his nickname. Osman Bey was his nickname while he was digging there in Turkey. And he was so proud of being there and doing this kind of work that he accepted that as his middle name. And the Turks actually gave him citizenship. They were also very thankful to him for his contributions. So this is where we stand today. There is actually a project Troja, and you can go to the website. I just sort of pasted this from the website. This is a cooperative undertaking between the University of Tübingen in Germany and the University of Cincinnati. In the summers, I think, people are still digging there. Now, when I was there in June, I didn't see anybody digging, but maybe later in the year they actually come. And they say that they have about 80 international archaeologists and other scholars who work at the site. Here are some of their foci or focuses. They are looking to explore the citadel and the lower city. They are trying to find the place of Troy in the Troad and see where the other places are around the city, for example, the harbor. They are doing what they call archaeobiological work. So you see this branches into other disciplines as well. And of course, they're also interested in conservation and in restoration. So I think this is what I can give you in terms of an overview of the excavation. And I hand it over to Dr. Thomas now, and you'll hear about the Iliad.
So, Dr. Kopp's given you a sense of all of the people who've been working on this site for a very long time. Well, I shouldn't say a very long time. They've been working on it since the 19th century, which in the long arc of the history of this place is very new. But people have been worried about, interested in where Homer's Troy was for a very long time. And what that looked like before modern archaeology was going out to the land and looking around, and looking at the Iliad and looking at the concrete descriptions of the location and lining them up with the land. There was, in order to make this work, right, and this is why modern archaeology is so important to this story, is that you don't just need to know where to look, you have to know when to look. I mean, Schliemann assumed that Homer's Troy would be at the bottom of the hill. So you bulldoze the hill and look at the bottom, right? Well, that just is coming from this completely, it turns out, uneducated presumption about the age of the civilization at Troy. It turns out there were people living in Troy thousands of years before Priam's Troy, before the Troy of the Trojan War. But when was the Trojan War? I mean, Homer doesn't give us a timeline. We have clues, but we don't have a date. It's not the way that that ancient epic works. It is quasi-mythological. Not every, I don't want to break anything, shatter your illusions, but there's some people who do not believe that Zeus and Athena actually exist, right? This book does not just have facts in it, but it does have some facts in it. How do you know what's what? How do you know what in the Iliad is worth taking seriously as something that you can go with on a project like this? It's called a project of Homeric topography, figuring out the lay of the land as Homer described it. Well, you can't do that just by knowing the where. Even if you knew the where, even if you knew that this place was called Castle Rock, it seems kind of obvious now, you have to know the when. And the when is difficult. It's difficult because we get so many different accounts of when the Trojan War might have been, because those accounts come to us from various texts and various traditions. It does come from all over the place, though. The other thing that makes it different is just the nature of the Homeric text itself. Not all of the Homeric text comes from the same era, but there are indications within the text of the oldest parts of it. And the oldest parts of it are most likely to correlate, obviously, to the actual historical event. One of these examples is the catalog of ships from Book 2. And there are many examples. We could take this apart. But you guys remember the end of Book 2 where you're reading a narrative and all of a sudden it's a list of who came from where, and you're like, really? Right? Do I need to know this? In the catalog of ships, for example, and there are other examples, Pylos, Nestor's home, Nestor's city of Pylos is mentioned. Pylos was destroyed in the 12th century BC and never rebuilt. This is a clue. There's also evidence within the shield of Achilles in the way people are dressed. That's not the only example, but seems to suggest a kind of a 13th century, perhaps, dating of parts of that part of the text. Another thing that's just kind of fun, I don't know that I put it on here, is the way that now that we have better understanding of ancient warfare, the mixed up nature of the warfare as it's described. They have chariots, which is a Bronze Age, 13th, 12th century convention, but they do their fighting on foot, which is a later Iron Age convention. And so you have this weird mixed up riding your chariot into battle and then jumping off and fighting, which probably, if it occurred, was never much of a convention, and it's Homer throwing together this old and this new. So it's in this oldest stuff, and this is what these guys are doing, exactly what you could do if you went to Troy, is they're reading the book, they're looking at the land, they're trying to make sense of when this was. And unless we can have some sense of when it was, it doesn't matter if we know where it is, we're not going to find it. Whether Troy was an actual place or not, we know where it was. I know that sounds crazy. But if we made up a fantasy city called Merceria and put it in middle Georgia on the Ocmulgee River, we'd know where it was, even if it was completely made up, right? So even if the Troy of the Iliad was a completely fictitious place. We know exactly where it were. We know almost exactly where it was. It's in the Troad. And it's really worth taking a second and looking at what makes this important. It's such an important spot in the modern world, not just in the ancient world. And we'll get a little closer here because, well, let's see it here first for a second. Because there's this tiny waterway that connects the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, called the Propontis in the ancient world, that then connects to the Black Sea, and it's the only way in, right? And the Troad is this peninsula that exists right by that strait, which is in the contemporary world called the Dardanelles, and in the ancient world called the Hellespont. This tiny bottleneck. It's also worth thinking of where it is in the world. This is the known world in the ancient world. Zeus and Poseidon Zeus in the Iliad, Poseidon in the Odyssey, they go on vacation to Ethiopia. Bad things happen when gods go on vacation. In the Trojan War, Achilles gets mad when Zeus goes on vacation to Ethiopia. In the Odyssey, when Poseidon takes a vacation to Ethiopia, all of a sudden Odysseus gets a chance to go home. Bad things happen when they go, but why Ethiopia? Because this is the end of the world, right? The southern end of the world. This is the whole world. Here's mainland Greece. Here is that little waterway, that little channel that takes you from the Aegean, from the Mediterranean, into the Black Sea. Even in the modern world, this is a hugely important spot. Look at all of the countries, the modern countries, that only have accessibility through this tiny area. The Bosphorus, which is the next little bottleneck before you get to the Black Sea, this is the dividing line between continents, between Asia and Europe. Very important spot. And the Troad sits right on it. Not only is the Troad the area that controls, the channel controls the Hellespont, but it actually has nice natural boundaries on the eastern side. It has Mount Ida, right? So, we know that this is where Troy is, whether it was or not. But we don't know exactly when, and it also gets difficult figuring out precisely where within the Troad it is. This is a fairly modern map of the coastline. And even though, again, we know where it is, we know that it's on the Hellespont, we know that the foothills of Ida are to the east, we know that there's a river running through the middle of it, and there's a modern river, the Menander, that looks like it must be the Scamander from the Iliad. There's another river that lines up and looks like it could be the Sosius. All of these things work, but when you start taking a little bit harder look, they all start falling apart. This is a view from the top of the mound in Troy, and you can see it's difficult because of the slide and the lighting. It's all kind of fuzzy. But you can see the water. This is the Hellespont out from some distance. The citadel is up on a natural hill, and then, of course, it's built up. And there's this long plain. And so it looks like it's close enough to really be a good candidate to be Troy, but there are all kinds of problems. And so the closeness, but the lack of precision between the text and the land made people fall into three groups, pretty clean and very passionate groups. One, the group that said, oh, absolutely, you can take this text from Homer, you can line it up with the land. Sure, there's some dodgy things, there's some things that don't quite fit, but it fits neatly enough that it's fair to say this is the spot. Troy is real. There were others who said this is ridiculous, this doesn't fit, the distances are off, the direction's off, there's no way that boats could have landed where Homer says they must have landed if we go. Troy is a fictitious place. This is an interesting archaeological site, but Troy doesn't exist. And then there's a very small third group who says, oh, Troy is a historical place, but it's not in Turkey. There's even a guy who thinks it's in England, right? So there's still crazy people out there. But these really passionate groups, until modern archaeology started settling, or at least clarifying some of these questions. So this is, like I told you before, one of my takeaways is the Iliad is very old, Troy is very old, archaeology is very new. And it's not just the building itself. I'm going to show you three things. This is the first of three things I want to show you about lining Homer up with Troy. This is just another copy of that same map that I showed you a second ago. You've got the Hellespont right here, this bottleneck, and it goes way up into the Black Sea. You've got the coastline here. You've got, from the east, you come in and you're on a level. You follow this little finger of a hill all the way out to the edge, and right to the west of Troy, it drops off into a plain. So you have this natural spot, elevated, where you can see the whole plain, and all the way down to the Hellespont and the sea, you can see everything. Any farther, if you moved any farther west from this spot, or any farther north from this spot, you would be down in the floodplain. So it really is a perfect spot to have a fortified city to control this really important channel. But it just doesn't work with the Homeric account. This is a map. The red line, you can see the maps aren't exactly the same scale, but can you see how this red line kind of follows this coastline there? Are you all with me on that? What they did in 1988, so we're not talking about 19th century archaeology anymore. We're talking about just 30 years ago, 25 years ago. They took core samples from this whole area to determine what the coastline would have been in the 12th or 13th century BCE. And all of a sudden, the Homeric picture starts coming into focus. This coastline here, everything in the middle here, is all silted in. It's all silt from these rivers that have built up and created land where in the Bronze Age there was no land. And with this new geography, again, these core samples done in the 80s, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, you have a whole new way of looking at it. Okay, so hang with me for a second. This is straight out of Homer. As I said, coming in from the east, you're on this hill, you follow the finger out. The white is the plain. I could have gotten a little bit more specific here, but I'm afraid it would have gotten more confusing. Some of this floods all the time and is very marshy. You see these little grass symbols around. Others of it, parts of it are elevated enough so that they're not marshy, although they still flood. Think Book 21 with Achilles fighting the river, right? It's a flood. It's other things too, but it's a flood. And it's a flood of this river, the Scamander. All kinds of things line up with this account from Troy. One of the things that I love is that you have hills. This has been identified as Kanakoliani, I think is what it's called. But it's a hill where in the battle, do you remember in the battle where the gods have been, Zeus has said, you guys go and you fight, you can do anything you want, you have at it, because now Achilles is in the battle. But for some reason the gods decide to hold back for a minute, and they both sit on hills to watch the battle. Well, one of these hills looks to be described as this one right here, and the other one appears to be described as this one right here, with the battle happening between it. Before, with the present coastline you can see indicated up there, it made no sense why the battle would be happening in this direction. Also, constantly, my favorite scene for the students who are in my class, is one of my favorite scenes is at the end of Book 6, where Hector and Andromache meet in the Western Gate. That's also the gate that Hector is thinking about going into when he and Achilles are running around the city. Why the Western Gate? Here's the Hellespont up to the north. Well, it's because of the way of the orientation of the battlefield to these marshes. And there are dozens of things like this that now we can begin to line up with the Homeric account that we couldn't before that 1988 study was done and the old coastline was uncovered for what it was. Now there are some things, many things actually, that are still very unclear. And in some cases, people admit that they're unclear, and in other cases, people just take passionate positions and argue them. That's all fine. The biggest example of this for me is where the Greek ship station is. That is where the Greek ships were beached for the battle. Down here is Bezhik Bay. And for a long time now, the scholarly consensus has been that the ship station was here, with the Greek boats going here. This does create that nice parallel that I talked to you with some gods sitting here, some gods sitting here, and I find some of those accounts very plausible, that the ship station would have been here. This is a place where you could actually beach without suffering the same kind of weather issues that you would up here. It's more protected. Also, this little spot right here has a mound on it. It's actually a mound that was rebuilt in Hellenistic times, but it's pretty clearly a mound that was built as a kind of reconstruction of the tomb of Achilles. At least the literature and the physical accounts all seem to suggest that this is the spot here. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, you'll see that Odysseus proudly tells Achilles of where his great monument is. And it looks like it was here. So that makes sense, right? That you would put the Achilleon, the tomb of Achilles, right near where the ship station is. But there's some problems with that, including the fact that they're constantly talking in the Iliad about, one, to the ships and to the Hellespont. And the Hellespont's really up here. You could stretch it and come down around here, but it just seems odd that they would do that. Again, I can see the other side and say, sure, that's fine. Another thing that's odd is within the Homeric account, we're told, I think it's at the beginning of Book 16, but on several occasions actually, that the fighting occurs in the area between the two rivers, the gates of Troy, and the ships. Well, there's no way to get between the two rivers. Here's the Simois, here's the Scamander, here's Troy. There's no way to get between the two rivers and Troy and be down here. Now, we go right back to the earlier schools of thought that approached these issues. One school of thought is going to say, this is real, and we're going to figure it out. Another's going to say, look, Homer wrote an epic, not a geographical treatise. Some of these things just aren't going to line up. Those people are also going to be supported by those who claim that the oral tradition behind the written text and the multiple traditions are bound to contradict each other. I understand both of those plausible positions. It has been the fact that a lot of things have been figured out, though, and so I'm open to the possibility of having somebody having solid account one of these days of where the ship station was. I think somebody's going to find something eventually that's going to help us figure that out. The guy who did this map, a guy named J.V. Luce, who has some fantastic books, and this is his map, he thinks the ship station was up here, way up here. All the way up here on what's called the Sigium Ridge. And one of the reasons that he advocates this theory is because of this thing called the Kazakh Cut. This is a clearly man-made cut in the earth that would have been a part of the defenses against chariots. We see this in the Iliad all the time, right? You can't run your chariot across these trenches. And he believes that this is an ancient trench that was a part of those battle works, and that the Greek ship station was above it. Maybe. All right. So this is Troy from the sky. these other two things should go a little quicker. This is Troy from the sky. You've seen all these maps of how they're layered. What you see here is Roman. A lot of what you see here is Roman. But this is the second thing I want to say about the history, the archaeology in the city. These are the layers. This is obviously not 46 layers. This is 9 layers of excavation at Troy. And this one that's expanded is Troy 6, which is believed to be Homer's Troy. Why? Well, it's got the right when. But there's some other things about it that are kind of fabulous and really convinced a lot of people that this is the city that Homer described. One is the Great Wall around the citadel. We have some pictures of that I'll show you. But the relationship between Troy 6 and Troy 7 is really what I find the most compelling. Troy 6 has this great wall, and the artifacts found in Troy 6 are evidence of great wealth. There's a megaron, which is a main building for the king or the leader at the very top of the hill. The buildings within these walls are grand. The avenues are wide, just like the city as it's described in the Iliad. Troy 7, which we don't see as well right here, Troy 7, it's in the same walls. All of these buildings remain, and yet in every tiny little space in this city, every wide boulevard, every part of the rampart, every space in between, every large, beautiful, well-built building, there is a small, thrown together shanty. So it looks like, why would you have a bunch of poorly built buildings inside a wall? There's a threat, right? It looks like Troy was besieged and everyone moved inside the wall. That's Troy 7, they call it 7A. Troy 7B, burned to the ground, destroyed. And Dr. Kopp said there's only this brief moment of history where Troy was not inhabited. That's the moment immediately after the destruction of 7. So big, beautiful, great walled, wealthy city that was besieged and then destroyed. All about the right time for Homer's account. This is too hard to see, but will show you this again just to say the pink wall is Troy 6. And unlike Schliemann, who bulldozed right in, archaeologists have been trying to preserve as many of these levels as they can. And so you see these tags where you go to Schliemann's cut and you try to recognize these different parts. Because even though the Troy of the Iliad is what was most interesting to Schliemann and to me, to be honest, all of these other Troys are important. And they're trying to both uncover Priam's Troy and keep these other things out. Okay, last thing I want to show you, and I can do this quickly. As Dr. Kopp said, the wall that we have now, the Great Wall of Troy, it's like a castle wall. What was happening inside this was all of those rooms that were described where Priam's sons and daughters lived with their husbands, and Andromache wove, and her women in waiting drew a bath for Hector and all these things. This is the royal family's area. It's not the whole city. And this is important when it comes to lining some of this up with Homer's Troy. These beautiful, huge walls are impressive, but they're just not nearly big enough to account for example, the run that Homer and Hector and Achilles do around the city. It just doesn't work. But if you, they've now done, if you recognize that this city existed outside of the walls of the citadel, just like medieval castles, the innermost part is the most secure, opulent part, but there's a huge city outside of the citadel. When you see that in Troy, then a lot of these accounts of the walls of Troy and how they work make sense. Again, why always talk about the western gate? It was from the western gate that you could get from the citadel down to the battlefield. Skip this. And this is the end of the part I want to show you. Show you three things, I guess, about when Hector and Achilles are running around the wall. First, the citadel wasn't big enough. This is plenty big for that account to start making more sense. Secondly, remember the weird part where Hector tries to get close to the wall and get get archers to cover him, but Achilles continues to keep him away from the wall so he can't get cover, and Hector has to keep running. Look at the way this works. Hector comes around the side and has to drop off the hill. I looked for a better illustration of this, then I couldn't. What it suggests is that, and again, are we taking this too literally? Maybe. There are these schools of thought, but all of this is more literal than people thought you could get 100 years ago. As you come around the edge, it appears it would take pretty remarkable strength to come in tight. The kind of strength that perhaps Achilles would have, and even Hector might not. Last thing, as they were excavating the citadel, and again, this lower wall wasn't excavated until the 90s, right? Like 91 or 92 is when they started finding parts of this wall. So very new excavation. One of the things that the naysayers of that this excavation was Troy was in that same account of Achilles and Hector running around the city, they run by a spring. There is no spring anywhere near here. Whether you're trying to do Homeric topography or not, that's a problem. A city needs a spring, and a besieged city needs a safe way to get to its water. There is a spring way out on the edge. If you go to the excavation now, you can actually go see it. Very close to the outer wall. So in the 90s, when this lower wall was discovered and its perimeter came so close to the spring, even that point of the Homeric account seemed to line up with this site.
All right, we've gone for an hour now, so I'm going to make this quick, I promise. What I'd like to do now is take you Great Bookers 101 into 202, because next spring you're all going to read the Aeneid by Virgil, and this is important to see that work in the tradition of the Homeric works and also of the site of Troy. The Romans were quite convinced right about the 4th century BC already that their mythological ancestors came from Troy. They thought that these refugees, these people who left the burning city of Troy, like Aeneas, for example, were their ancestors. So they actually visited the site of Troy. We know from Livy, the historian, that in 190, for example, 190 BC, Lucius Cornelius Scipio visited the city of Troy. So even in 190 BC, so you have to imagine, this is around the time of the Carthaginian Wars. And then in later periods, Julius Caesar, for example, and his successor Octavian, later Augustus, used this for their official propaganda. What you see here is a coin that Caesar minted in 47 BC. And I think what you can see is Aeneas carrying his father Anchises on his back out of the burning Troy. And in his hand, he's carrying the Palladium, the symbol of Athena. Now, more often in modern depictions, you see this kind of scene. You see Aeneas with his father on his back, and then he's leading his young son Ascanius, or also called Iulus, by his hand. And I think the woman in the back here behind the group is Creusa, that would have been Aeneas' wife, whom he actually lost in the turmoil, and who didn't actually make it back to the ships and out of Troy. This is a modern painting, of course, but it depicts the same scene. And then, of course, you get the Aeneid itself, and this is the text you will all read next semester by Virgil, which in a way is the official celebration of Augustus and the ties of the Julio-Claudian family to Troy. You all know, or may not, that Ascanius, the little son of Aeneas, has a second name. His second name is Iulus. And if you take the U out of Iulus, you get Ilus. And you probably remember what I told you earlier about the name of Troy, the other name, Ilion, right? So there's the connection. And then Iulus gives rise to the Julio-Claudian family. And by doing so, of course, this family lays claim to the fact that a goddess is one of their ancestors, Venus, the mother of Aeneas. So we know from historical accounts that in 42, after the Battle of Philippi, both Octavian and Antony, Mark Antony, who were still working together at that point, were settling some of their veterans in Troy, the 16th Legion. And in 20 BC, Octavian, then Emperor Augustus, actually visited Troy. And that started sort of a tourism. People wanted to go there and see the site of their ancestors. Hadrian, in the next century, in 124 AD, also came. And another 100 years later, in 214 AD, Caracalla, the Emperor Caracalla, came to Troy. And each time these emperors came, more buildings were built, and this town became more and more wealthy and splendid. This all ended in 267 when the Goths pillaged Troy, and there was one more period where it got resurrected, and it lasted until about the era of Constantine the Great. And the story goes that before Constantine actually founded Constantinople, he entertained the idea of making Troy the capital of the Roman Empire. Now, think about this for a moment. What would have been, could have been, you know? If that plan had gone through, there would be no Istanbul today, and there would probably be a mega city in the Troad, which would now be probably the capital of Turkey. Now, in 500 AD, there was an earthquake in the area, and that ended the presence of the Romans in that area. Now, this is what you can see at the site today. These are remains from a temple, most likely the temple of Athena, which was originally built in Hellenistic time and was increased by various people, including Alexander the Great, who stopped there on the way to a campaign against the Persians. And these are blocks from the coffered ceiling of that temple. You can actually find that on the top of the citadel, which is really interesting because the Romans and the Greeks before them had to cut into the hill, and they took off layers. They were worse than Schliemann, really. They took off some of the layers of Troy 6 and 7 in order to build their Troy 8. And so to create a platform on which they could build such a large temple. And this piece comes probably from the ceiling of that temple. Here you have another view. You also have various columns, fluted columns, that most likely come from that era. They were found next to what they call a bouleuterion, a council building that was originally built in Hellenistic time and later increased by the Romans. Here's another thing they found. These are Roman baths. They were built under the Emperor Hadrian, so they were probably built when Hadrian visited. They are right across the place where I just showed you the fluted columns. And if you go in there, you can see mosaics in on the floor. So shows you that these were originally the floors of baths. Across from the baths is the Odeon, which was started under Augustus and then renovated by Hadrian. So it's a small theater for musical performances. The Romans had those Odeons in all their towns in the Mediterranean world, but they certainly had one in Troy. Nice little place for shows, and sometimes you can even still see the seats that the Romans actually used. In that Odeon, this statue was found. And it's a statue of Hadrian, which further gives us an idea that Hadrian was involved in the construction of this Odeon. This is now in the in the Archaeological Museum in Çanakkale, which is the next larger town, I would say about 15 to 20 miles north of Troy. I wanted to show you this, even though you may not be able to see it very well, but in the front here, on this block, there is an inscription. But if you look more closely, and if you could look more closely, you would see that this is a Greek inscription. So it's not necessarily Latin writings. Even though this was a Roman town, a lot of the daily life was conducted bilingually or probably even totally in Greek. So this inscription is Greek. Now, this is not Troy. This is a picture from Pergamon, which is about 70 miles south of Troy. It's another site where the Romans had a town. But I'm showing you this picture to give you an idea what Troy might have looked like. This is the Temple of Trajan in Pergamon. It's called the Trajaneum, I guess. And that really gives you an idea of the splendor of the place. This is the theater of Miletus, a little further south, but another Roman city in Turkey today. And you can see the size of theater there. Now the thing is, in Troy, there is such a theater. It hasn't been excavated, at least not completely. And so we can assume that Troy probably featured a very similar building like this. And this, of course, is probably the crown jewel of Roman remains in Turkey today. This is the library of Celsus in Ephesus. Ephesus is a remarkable site. You have a lot of buildings still standing, and this was the facade of that library. But it's just so intriguing to think that buildings like that were actually present in Troy as well. Now in Ephesus, the archaeologists have actually uncovered houses and the insides of houses. So you can actually go under this huge modern roof construction and can peek into the houses of ordinary Romans. So what you see here are the paintings on the walls of the Roman houses in Ephesus. Once again, this is not Troy, but this is what Troy might have looked like. And that really brings us to the end of our little lecture today. But before I let you go, I want to put in a little plug. If you are now interested in seeing all of this, you can actually do so. Because next spring I am planning to offer a classical literature course. It's called CLA 101, in which we read a lot of the materials that you probably have already encountered in great books, but we add a little. So you'll have an overview of Greek and Roman epic, lyric, and tragedy in that course. But the little perk is that I would like to take the class to Troy and to Turkey in spring break next spring. So we will connect this with another one-credit course called CLA 153S. And if you sign up, we will spend spring break in Troy, and we will fly into Izmir, we will see Ephesus, we will see Miletus, we will then go to Pergamon, and we will go to Troy. And then you can actually bring your Iliad and can see if you can make some of the connections that we've tried to show you tonight. We will also spend 2 days in Istanbul on our way back. So if you're interested in that, I left on each side, on the chairs, at the wall, I left a flyer for you, so please feel free to take that and look it over. Some more details are on that. And if you are interested in getting some emails from me with information about upcoming informational meetings, put your name on the list. I'm pretty certain that on Friday, the 5th of October, I'm going to show slides of the things that we'll see on the trip at 10 o'clock in room 100. Friday, 5th of October.